Charlotte, it's the examiner. Are you waiting on me to go, or are the council going to introduce?
No, it will be you that starts the hearing.
Okay, well, I'll turn the camera on and we'll get going. Well, good morning, everybody. I hope you can all hear me. My name is Philip Stadden. I'm the examiner appointed to undertake the assessment of the community infrastructure levy proposals put forward by Runnymede Borough Council. It might be useful, I'm not quite sure how we're going to do this, and I'll take some guidance from Charlotte, if we could have some introductions at this stage, just so we know who's actually taking part. Could we go to the council first to run through the council team?
Good morning, sir. I'm Georgina Pacey. I'm the local plans manager at Runnymede, and I'm in a room a couple of metres apart from...
Good morning, sir. And my name's Rachel Renaud. I'm the corporate head of planning policy economic development at Runnymede. And also on the line is our colleague, John Devonshire.
Well, good morning to all three of you. And I think you have Mr. Goland as well, who's your consultant, yes?
That's right, Dr. Andrew Golland. Good morning, sir, and everybody else, helping the council with viability.
Thank you. Okay, who else would like to introduce themselves? Go on, don't be shy.
Good morning, sir. My name is Graham Stevens. I'm a director at Stride Treglown. We're representing Royal Holloway, University of London.
Good morning, Mr. Stevens.
Good morning.
Okay, who's next?
Good morning, sir, and everyone. I'm John Tenconi. I'm representing myself as a local resident of Virginia Water and the Wentworth Residents Association and the Virginia Water Neighbourhood Forum.
Thank you, Mr. Tenconi. Okay, who's next?
Good morning, sir. My name's Andrew Jackson. I'm a director at Boyer Planning. I'm representing A2 Dominion, a registered provider.
Good morning, Mr. Jackson. Okay, who's next?
Good morning, sir. Steve Smith from Turley Development Viability, representing Taylor Wimpey and Richborough Estates.
Good morning, Mr. Smith.
Thank you.
Okay, who's next?
Good morning, it's Andrew Renshaw, Senior Associate Director at Stride Treglown, along with Graham Stevens, representing Royal Holloway, University of London. I should add that I've also worked with Danehurst Developments, but I'm not representing them today.
Okay, thank you. Who else do we have? Is that everybody?
I don't think I've introduced myself. I'm Bob Bratland from Danehurst Developments.
Danehurst, yeah. Morning, Mr. Bratland.
Good morning. We're in the process of building our 4th student accommodation scheme in Egham.
Well, good morning. Okay, thank you. Right, well, if I just say a few words of introduction before we go to some opening statements. As you know, the Council's Community Infrastructure Levy proposal, CIL as we'll call it from now on, they're set out in the draft charging schedule, and there's also a statement of modifications. And in essence, what I'm picking up from those documents is that the Council is proposing 3 different sets of charges. The first set relate to residential class developments, and here the charges are zoned. We've got 7 zones from A to G, and they vary from a 0 rate up to the highest rate, which I think is £380. 3 different sets of charges. So that's the first set relate to residential class to student accommodation development, and there is a flat rate charge proposed of £495 per square metre across the borough. And the third set of charges relates to office development, where there is a proposed £50 per square metre charge. And the schedules make clear that all other development would be zero rated. I'll perhaps just say a little bit about the examination and the virtual format that we're undertaking, and I'll hold my hands up and say that this is the first virtual format hearing that I've undertaken. I suspect it may be the same for others. I know Charlotte, our programme officer, has some experience of other virtual hearings, and has given me some generally good feedback on those. But it is perhaps a new experience for me and for others, and we will have to see how it works out. I have taken some soundings from others that have been involved as well as Charlotte, and generally the feedback has been pretty good, that people do feel that it's relatively close to the real thing. But let's just see how we go. I want to certainly make sure that through the wonders of technology, everybody feels that they have had their say and they've had the opportunity to speak directly to me. Now, you should have...
Phil, sorry to interrupt you, but your camera seems to have gone off, I think.
Am I back in the room?
You are.
First technical glitch of the day. I'm sure there'll be some more.
That's fine.
Okay. Well, just in terms of setting the scene, you should have 4 papers that were distributed by Charlotte fairly recently. The first is my examiner's note, which is dated the 14th of October. And that just sets out a little bit about the background to community infrastructure levy, what the examination sets out to do, and a little bit about the hearing sessions. There is a second document which gives some detailed guidance notes for the virtual hearing, and I hope you've read that and you're familiar with the various controls and the idea of clicking on the raise hand button so that I know when somebody wants to speak. And it may be that as we get into the later sessions where there is, I want to have a bit more of a round table discussion, I mean, particularly around the residential CIL evidence, and also around the student accommodation evidence, that we have a number of mics open at the same time, just to see if we can get as close as we can to the round table type proceedings that I would normally preside over. The third document you should have received is the privacy notice. That's from the council and just explains how it is dealing with privacy matters. And then the fourth document, which I'm just going to just very briefly run through, and it might be helpful if Charlotte could get this one up on the screen. This is the main issues and the virtual hearing agenda. Are you able to put that on the screen, Charlotte? Fantastic. And at the top of the page, you'll see the 7 main issues and questions. Now, for anybody familiar with the world of CIL, there won't be any surprises there. They're drawn directly from the guidance and the legislation. I mean, in essence, there are 2 aspects there. One is around procedural compliance, but the main bulk of it is all about viability. It's about the effect of the CIL proposals on the viability of development that's planned across the borough. So if Charlotte could just scroll down, and I'll talk through the hearing agenda. It is broken into a series of sessions, and I have put some time estimates there. They're not by any means rigid, and we we don't need to fill up that time if we don't need it. But I wanted to make sure that where the greatest areas of dispute are, the greatest area of challenge to the CIL proposals, we've got sufficient time to look at those. So session 1, that we're obviously in that at the moment, is my introduction, and we're shortly going to have an opening statement from the council. There's also, I think Mr. Stevens is going to give one, and I think Mr. Tenconi. And if anybody else wishes to, please let me know. Then once we've got through that, if we go to session 2, I've got a short session there, really just a fact check around making sure that I've understood the Runnymede 2030 local plan. I've got a few questions on that, but that won't take us very long. Session 3 is a relatively short session. This is around background evidence on infrastructure, and we'll have a look at the infrastructure delivery plan, the IDP, and some of the related documents. And we'll look there at the funding gap, or the council's calculation of the funding gap, and what revenues might come forward from CIL. And then session 4, we get into the heavy stuff. This is the meaty part of the agenda. For those unfamiliar with these sorts of sessions, they can be quite long, quite complicated, and it is quite heavy stuff. But I've over the years that I've been doing CIL examinations, there is a certain logical flow to them, in the sense that I'm going to ask the council to run through firstly its approach and its evidence, just to summarise that, and then we will look at the modelling assumptions. Now, with any sort of viability modelling, some of the variables can have a huge impact on what comes out the other end in terms of results, and it's inevitably quite fertile ground for challenges. And we've got, if we just look at the assumptions, got challenges on land values, sales values, construction costs, housing mix and density. And it's just an opportunity for me to hear what the council has done, and to hear some challenges to the assumptions made. I think it's really important to stress that my job here is not to get you to agree. It's fine me listening to different views. I'm not here to get you to close the gap or whatever. I'm just here to listen to the different views, hear the council's evidence, and hear any contrary views. So we'll go through all of those bullet pointed assumptions, and then if you could just scroll down a little further, please. And then we'll see. Well, yeah, stop it there. That's. We'll look at the results that come out of the modelling. So when all of those assumptions have been put into the modelling, what are the results that the council has modelled? And there's 3 sets of those: the high-level testing, the key larger housing sites, and the smaller housing sites analysis. And then following on from that, we'll look at, those are the council's results, accepting that there may be some disputes around the inputs and assumptions made, but how has the council then used those results to inform its zones and charges? How has that worked out? And we'll look at that. We'll repeat in session 5. We'll repeat the same exercise for student accommodation development. Session 6, we'll look at office development. And then we've got some shortish sessions. Session 7, I just want to turn the pages on the testing of various commercial developments that the council's undertaken, and the proposed 0 CIL rate. And then session 8 is a sort of mop up on anything else. We'll have a chat about the instalment policy if anybody wishes to, and I've almost got like an AOB in there, just to round up anything else. And then the final session is just an opportunity for summing up by representatives and by the council, and then I'll say a few words around the timetable for reporting, and then we'll close. Now, I should say as well that I think spending all day staring at a screen is going to be pretty hard work for all of us. So I'm going to be fairly disciplined around breaks. We will take, I want to take at least a full hour at lunchtime, which will probably be 1 till 2. And we'll also take a mid-morning and a mid-afternoon break. So that's perhaps enough from me. I'm going to now invite the council to make its opening statement.
Thank you, sir. The Borough Council considers that the rates proposed in its CIL draft charging schedule as submitted with modifications strike the right balance between, firstly, a desire to raise funding towards the infrastructure required to support development coming forward in Runnymede, and secondly, the need to ensure the continued economic viability of development in the borough. The Council considers that the draft CIL charging schedule has been prepared in accordance with the Planning Act 2008 as amended and the CIL Regulations 2010 as amended, as well as advice set out in the Government's Planning Practice Guidance Note on CIL. In drafting its charging schedule, the Council has undertaken 2 rounds of public engagement on the draft charging schedule and modifications. The first round of public engagement ended in April 2020, just as the COVID-19 pandemic was taking hold. And in light of this, undertook a second round on modifications to the draft charging schedule, which closed in August 2020. Both rounds of engagement are considered to have met the requirements for engagement as set out in the CIL regulations. Through its infrastructure evidence, such as the infrastructure delivery plan and infrastructure schedules, which were considered by a local plan inspector at the Runnymede 2030 local plan examination, the Council can demonstrate that it has an infrastructure funding gap, which necessitates the need to implement a CIL charging schedule. In calculating the infrastructure funding gap, the Council has had regard to other sources of funding, which along with CIL, can help to close that funding gap. And there's more on this in the Council's technical background document. With this in mind, the Council has aimed to strike a balance between the need to fund infrastructure and the economic viability of development. The rates proposed in the draft CIL charging schedule and its modifications are supported by robust evidence of development viability across the borough, through the CIL Viability Assessment, which is reference CIL 10, and in response to the potential economic impact of COVID-19 through the CIL Viability Addendum, and that's CIL 11. The Council estimates that its proposed CIL rates would raise around £18.5 million towards infrastructure funding up to 2030, which includes around £4.2 million towards local infrastructure projects through neighbourhood funding element. As such, the Council considers through robust and credible evidence robust and credible infrastructure and viability evidence, as well as its technical background documents, reference CIL 8 and 9, how its proposed levy rates will contribute towards the implementation of the Runnymede 2030 local plan and support development across the area. Based on the appropriate available evidence, the Council therefore invites the CIL examiner to agree the draft charging schedule and rates set out therein for approval. Thank you.
Thank you. Could we have Mr. Stevens next, please?
Thank you, sir. On behalf of our client, Royal Holloway, University of London, our representations are limited into the manner in which evidence has been collated and considered to inform the draft CIL charging schedule relating to student accommodation and its impact on the deliverability of the Runnymede local plan. We intend to highlight both areas of common ground and dispute between the revised evidence presented by Andrew Golland Associates AGA on behalf of the Council and that presented by the University. We will endeavour to draw out particular aspects of the 2 submissions presented in the form of a timeline related to the stages of the CIL drafting to date. In summary, the original AGA viability evidence estimated a surplus of £2,000 per square metre for student accommodation. Following evidence supplied in April 2020 by the University and Danehurst Developments Limited, a specialist private sector developer with experience of delivering purpose-built student accommodation in the area, AGA revised their evidence, concluding that the estimated surplus fell to £825 per square metre. Despite this new empirical evidence and an officer's recommendation to the July Planning Committee that the CIL rate for student accommodation be reduced from £495 to £345 per square metre, the council decided to retain the higher CIL rate. Given the principle that CIL charges are justified by means of appropriate and robust evidence, the university challenged the position taken by the council. In relation to consultation and engagement, and as set out in our first representation of April, the university confirms that no approach has been made from AGA to discuss and share data relating to student accommodation bedroom provision, demand, supply, type, construction cost, bedroom size, rental levels, or management approaches, all issues which the university has considerable experience given their role as the main provider of such accommodation in the borough for many years. The university considers that had AGA approached them during the collation of the original and revised evidence base, the nuances which exist between on and off campus, university and private sector, cluster flats and studio apartments would have been better understood, and a different approach to the draft CIL charging schedules could have been taken. In 2015, the university obtained outline planning permission for development required to increase from 8,600 students to 12,000 students by 2031. This included provision for 2,650 student bedrooms on campus. However, some of the student accommodation developments illustrated in the accompanying master plan are now not realistic, and a hardening of attitudes to the concentration of student accommodation adjacent to the residential area of Englefield Green has led the university to review its accommodation strategy. Since the completion of a series of developments following the master plan, which have contributed towards improving the academic experience of university students, including a £57 million library and student services centre and a state-of-the-art science building, the university has risen 5 places to become a top 20 UK university in the Times and Sunday Times Good University Guide 2020. With approximately 10,500 current students, the university has reached the 2020 target for itself in relation to student numbers. This has enabled the university to both remain a successful and financially stable university and continue their substantial contribution to the local economy. The university is situated on the edge of Egham and Englefield Green. Egham is a town of only circa 12,000 population, and Englefield Green still considers itself a village community. Enabling more students to live in university-controlled accommodation will have a positive impact on the local area by reducing the huge pressure on local housing, which has led to hundreds of houses of suburban family homes being let to students. The imposition of a CIL charge of £495 per square metre would prevent additional on-campus, university-controlled, purpose-built student accommodation to be provided. The representations submitted on behalf of the university demonstrate that inappropriate evidence has been applied and which has overestimated the surplus for such developments can achieve. Through this examination, we would be pleased to expand upon aspects of the underlying evidence. We'd also support a debate relating to an alternative approach based on the type of student accommodation provided and the degree to which CIL could be applied going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Stevens. I believe that Mr. Tenconi is going to make a statement. Mr. Tenconi, could you unmute and join us?
Hopefully, I've managed to achieve that.
I can see the top of your head, sir.
Is that better?
Yes, that's it. Perfect.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, so the representations that I want to make, sir, are really about concerns that the residents of Virginia Water have, that there is a conceptual difficulty in the application of Section 106 and CIL charges with regard to the specific development of Long Cross and its effect on Virginia Water. And we think there are 3 key points, which are against the background that it is said that all Long Cross contributions will be Section 106 contributions. there is a considerable state of flux in the ongoing implementation of Longcross. Longcross was designed to be a self-sustaining garden village, and currently we know that there are questions around the originally planned car parking for the station at Longcross, which was designed to be part of its self-sustaining character. Also around where and how and when early stage and primary educational facilities will be provided. And thirdly, around the question of the provision of the originally envisaged primary healthcare facilities. And when these points were raised originally with the council, they came back with various answers to the representations. But as we speak, we know that there will now not be a primary provision of primary healthcare. There will be, or is proposed to be, a very substantial reduction in the number of car parking places at the station at Longcross, down to I think around 40. And we still don't have much detail on if and when the early stage and primary education facilities will be provided. All of these matters will impact directly on the existing overstretched infrastructure in Virginia Water. Without exception, those three will have a significant effect. The concern that we have is that Section 106 contributions in respect of those matters seem to have not been considered at this point and are not quantified. CIL is said not to apply. CIL is said not to apply because it would be damaging to the integrity of the development. But the suggestion might be that CIL would be more expensive for the developer than continuing Section 106, which is as yet unquantified. So really what we want to do so is to highlight that if we're not very careful here, there will be a planning disaster in the Virginia Water area, in that the ongoing implementation of the local plan seems to be changing without due regard to how the changes will be dealt with to prevent Longcross from simply becoming an extension of a riven development with Virginia Water, relying on substantial parts of its already creaking infrastructure, and ignoring the fact that the originally envisaged concept of Longcross was a self-sustaining garden village. That really is the essence of our representation, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Tanconi. It's all clear. Okay, is there anybody else that wishes to make any opening remarks? If so, could you unmute and put yourself on screen and speak away? I'm going to take that as a no. Okay, well we'll move on to the next session, which is session 2 concerning the development plan. And I'm addressing this primarily to the council, just to make sure that I've understood the plan correctly. This is a really important just sense check for me, because I do remember I did a CIL examination a few years ago, and there was quite robust representations submitted by a developer that was promoting quite a large urban extensions, a couple of thousand new units, and it was the subject of a planning application, but it wasn't contained within a quite recently adopted core strategy. It was a speculative proposal, and they were arguing that the CIL being put forward would threaten the viability of their speculative scheme. Important point there is that when you look at CIL examination, the development that you're testing the viability on is that set out in the local plan. It's not other development that people may aspire to progress. It is the planned development. So that's a really important point. So I've been through the Runnymede 2030 local plan, and I think I understand it. I've looked at the spatial strategy SD1 and picked up the figure of 7,507 dwellings in the planned period. Of that number, I think I saw somewhere there was a balance figure to be provided. Could you help me on that? What is the balance to be found?
Do you mean how many completions and how many commitments have we had to date?
Yes, sorry.
Okay. So to date, we have had 2,033 completions. I'm just looking on my notes because I know I've got this written down. Let me have 2,033 completions since the 1st of April 2015 to 31st of March 2020. And there are currently 1646 commitments, 1,646 commitments.
That's sites with planning permission?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, so okay, that's clear. One thing I was picking up from the plan and the evidence was that there were quite a significant number of greenfield sites and sites released from the Greenbelt. Is there a proportion, of that number, whether it's the full number or the net number? I'm just trying to get a feel for what proportion of the housing is going to come forward effectively on greenfields.
Okay. I do have some figures here. I'm just seeing if it will answer your question, sir. I have prepared a small paragraph with some of these numbers in, so hopefully this will help you. The Greenbelt release sites are a mixture of brownfield and greenfield, and aside from Longcross, they're medium-sized sites ranging from 75 to 275 dwellings. Taking aside the Longcross Garden Village site, the 1,873 dwellings will be delivered on Greenbelt release sites around Addlestone, Chertsey, Ottershaw and Virginia Water, amounting to approximately 1,389 units on greenfield or predominantly greenfield sites. Those sites in Egham and Englefield Green are on predominantly brownfield sites and will deliver around 484 units. The percentage of development expected to come forward on Greenbelt sites is therefore around 75% greenfield and 25% brownfield.
That's really helpful. Okay. Perhaps just something else I picked up from reading through the plan is that particularly with SD2, where you've got all the site allocations, is that am I right in saying that it feels like the plan, you know where the sites are that are going to deliver? I mean, some particularly core strategies can be a bit more vague on that and criteria based, but it does seem I was sort of picking up from reading the plan that that it's quite mature in terms of, given the constraints of the borough, you kind of worked out what is achievable, what's deliverable, and there aren't going to be many sort of sites sort of popping out of the woodwork. Is that a fair observation?
Yeah, I think it is. As you rightly point out, the borough is heavily constrained, which severely limited, in our view, the sites that we could reasonably take forward, more strategic sites. Prior to the adoption of the local plan, the Greenbelt in Runnymede hadn't been amended since 1986, and the urban area boundaries were very tightly drawn. So what you'll see through this plan is the strategic releases or the large releases through policy SD2, and then what really that leaves you with is those small windfall sites or other opportunity sites that may come forward through the urban area, but the bulk of your supply or the supply through the local plan will be through these sites.
Okay, and I was listening to Mr. Tenconi earlier talking about Longcross Garden Village, and I did read policy SD9,
yes.
and it's one of the longest policies I've read in a while. It's quite detailed, a whole set of requirements for the new settlement there. I just wanted a little bit of background information on, not so much on the allocation itself, but the planning status in terms of, is there a planning application? Is there a Section 106 under negotiation? What stage is it at?
Permission has been granted for some development on the northern site, and that is under construction. In terms of the bulk of the site, which is the southern site, at the current time there is not a planning application on that site. My understanding is that a planning application is due early January. Sorry, my colleague has been out to get an update for you, sir, so I will pass you over to Rachel Renaud. The examiner's just asking for an update on Longcross, and have we got 106? I said northern site has permission, southern site.
No, not really. The application is expected very early January on the southern site.
And the southern site is what in terms of numbers? Is that the main part of the
Yes, that's the bulk of the housing.
Is there a number of units?
They're in discussions at the moment where it could be a little bit more than was indicated in the local plan, potentially up to 1,700.
Okay. Okay. And just changing subjects to employment. Could you just, I got a little bit confused when I was reading the plan on employment. We're going to be talking later about the proposal for a CIL on office development. Could you just clarify the square meterage figures in the plan and where that development would be?
We have an allocated site of 20,000 at the Byfleet Road in Newhall, and there is a permission of 79,000 square metres of business park at Longcross. That provides a net of 7,350.
Sorry, is that at Longcross? Is that part of the Garden Village development?
Yes, that is part of the Garden Village, and that is also zoned as an enterprise zone.
So that would be in the zero CIL zone.
Yes, it would.
Right. You mentioned the 20,000 square metres at Newhall, but when I looked at the policy which deals with that, I think it's on page 157 of the plan. Yeah. It didn't refer to office development. It referred to.
No, sorry. Yes, you're correct. Yeah, that is for an industrial warehousing.
Light industrial.
There is possibility for some small amount of ancillary office to support that other development there, but it isn't a main office development. No, you're correct on that.
Okay. Now my only other question was on affordable housing. And
I was just going to say, in terms of office, the bulk of office will be coming forward probably within the strategic employment sites, particularly along the causeway, and possibly some of the other strategic employment sites, with the exception really of Thorpe Industrial Estate, which again is a mainly logistics, light industrial location.
Okay, that's helpful. Sorry, jumping back to housing. Sorry, my notes are a little disorganised. The affordable housing, I just wanted to sense check the requirement, because it links later to our discussion on assumptions made. So policy SL20, which is on page 105. Just get that up. So you've got a policy requirement of 35% on sites of 10 or more, and tenure split is 30-70 in favour of rented, yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, we'll perhaps touch on that a bit later. Okay, I'm just going to... Those are my questions on the plan. I'm just going to see if there is anybody that wants to say anything about the plan. I should stress my role here is not to revisit local plan issues. It's just fact finding in terms of what is relevant for the CIL examination. But if anybody wishes to make any comments that may help me, if they want to use that opportunity now. If not, we'll move on. Okay, I'll take the silence of consent to move on. We're going to go now to session 3, which is infrastructure. Oh, Mr. Tenkoni, I've got a hand up from you. So would you like to unmute and speak?
Yes, sir. I think perhaps one relevant thing is that in the context of the interrelationship between CIL payments and 106 payments, when we put the original boundary forward for the neighbourhood plan, we did attempt to include a substantial part of Longcross within that boundary, because we felt that the futures of Longcross and Virginia Water were inextricably linked. The council was not amenable to that request and took Longcross out of our boundary, so that we now run along the railway line to the north of Longcross, so north of the station and the car parking areas and the film studios. And to us, that's conceptually interesting, because were there to be any CIL involved here at some stage, the question of attribution of parts of the proceeds of CIL would have to go to a neighbourhood plan. But in the circumstances that now prevail, that would be Longcross. So absences of infrastructure in Longcross causing problems at Virginia Water would actually cause a contribution to Longcross, and it's very unclear what Longcross would use that to fix, assuming it actually had a neighbourhood plan. So there does seem to us to be a logical difficulty here. That does, of course, presuppose CIL contributions, but we are wondering what alternative there is if the Section 106 framework is no longer going to work as a result of systematic reverse sausage salami slicing on the original local plan concept of a garden village that's sustainable. Understood. I'll see if the council wishes to comment at all on that. The officers wish to say anything?
All I would say, sir, is that when we considered the application for the Virginia Water neighbourhood area, my recollection, because I think it was March 2019, so I am speaking off the top of my head a little, I don't believe there was any representation at that point in the forum within the Longcross area, which is why we took it out. And we also didn't feel it was appropriate for a strategic site to be located in the wider Virginia Water neighbourhood area. So that was the reasons why the council decided it wasn't appropriate. I don't think I have any other points to add unless my colleagues do.
Okay. Well, I think we may come back to it later when we look at the modelling on Longcross Garden Village and what assumptions have been made there. But we'll move on for now. Okay. Well, let's go to session 3. And this is really in the same vein as looking at the local plan. We'll have a quick look at the infrastructure evidence, and it might be helpful here if the one of the council officers was able to give me just a little bit of background in terms of I think it's the 2017 report, which I assume was part of the evidence base for the local plan. So if you could just give me a quick summary of the origin of that document, what it did, how it was produced, that would be really helpful. So, Mr. Devonshire, going to pick that up. Yes, I got that, and yeah, if I've got CIL 09 in front of me, and I'm on page 7, and so in summary, it's telling me that if you put Longcross to one side, you've got an assessed cost of infrastructure for the plan period of 229 million, 229.2. you've assessed that 124.1 may be available, potential secured funding, and that gives you the gap of 105.1 million. Okay. I should say, from having done probably about 25 CIL examinations now, I have yet to come across a council that has been unable to demonstrate an infrastructure funding gap. It's one of the easier tasks for a council. So your funding gap is assessed at 105, and then you've calculated. I wanted a bit of clarity on how you've calculated the likely CIL revenue. I think it's, if you've got CIL 9 in front of you, I think it's on page 24. I'd just like to understand what you did there. And the figure that appears there, if we take the gross figure of 23.794 million at the bottom, and then you've got a net figure of 19.5. I got a feeling in the opening statement there was a figure of 18.5 mentioned. So just clarify that for me. Just explain how it's been worked out and what the bang up to date figure is. Got you. Okay. Okay. The figures and the proportions are not dissimilar to others I've come across over the years. But I just again ask the question: does anybody else want to make any comments on the background infrastructure evidence and the funding gap? No, I'm not getting no indications there, so I'll move on. I'll tell you, this is moving really efficiently compared to meeting in a council chamber. We're making great progress, but I sense our next session might be a little longer. Let's move then to session 4, and this relates to economic viability evidence relating to residential class development. As I mentioned in my introduction, this tends to be quite a heavy session. We are going to look at the council's approach to viability testing, which has got a bit of history, as I understand it, because there was some testing that supported the local plan evidence base. But I'm going to begin by asking the council's viability consultant just to run through exactly what he did. So if you could, Mr. Gollan, could give us some sort of summary of the approach that he's undertaken in producing his report. That would be really helpful.
Yes, certainly, sir. Can you hear me? Can everybody hear me?
I can hear you, yes, and I can see you too.
Perfect. So I shall principally refer to document CIL 10, which is the obviously still viability report, which hopefully everybody has seen, and really just pick out a few key aspects of it and say something about the kind of context for it in terms of how it takes it towards the CIL that the council has set. So in terms of the kind of key points of reference, the principles for viability assessment are set out in chapter 2 of the report of CIL 10. This shows that our approach looks at both the position of the developer and the needs of that developer to make a margin, as well as the position of the landowner, who needs to be financially incentivised to bring the site forward. And there we kind of introduce the concept of residual value, and look also at the issue of land value benchmark, which is shown in the chart in chapter 2, which could be set at different levels. It could be set at greenfield, could be set at brownfield, or could be set in some other different way, for example, alternative use value. The report contains no reference to residual land value, which to a large extent confuses, I think, the viability assessment process. The report focuses on the concept of EUV, existing use value, as the basis for assessing viability, and this is in line with practice over the past 20 years, and now finally included, hooray, in the MPPG of 2019. The focus, therefore, of the viability assessment, once you've accepted the requirement for a developer to make a margin, obviously they have to make a margin, should be therefore on the financial position of the landowner without the planning consent, and the financial position of that landowner, assuming consent is granted. This latter position, consent granted, is reference to residual value, assuming a scheme is policy compliant, as well as obviously still compliant where that applies. And the difference between the existing use value and the residual value at policy is the plus element that the NPPG seeks to interrogate. In terms of the mechanics, I've used the Three Dragons Toolkit, which is an industry standard model. It was one I helped to develop back in 2001, originally for the Greater London Authority. The model was independently audited by BNP Paribas, who are probably the leading viability consultant in the country, and found to be sound, with minor modifications in 2007 and 2012. The toolkit runs across the capital. I'm now updating it for the GLA, and with some of the local versions across the regions and authority in England and Wales. The approach that's been used in this study emulates the approach precisely that we took to viability for the testing in the local plan work. For residential, that's the bulk of the study, and that's what the bulk of the CIL will relate to. The report, if you like, takes a belt and braces approach, which recognises the need, for example, to do high-level testing, site-specific testing, and to look at the implications of small sites as well. The reason for doing high-level testing is to take account, in essence, of all possible viability situations, both for allocated sites and for sites which might come forward as windfall. So you've got a robust starting point under all circumstances. It is obviously it's location specific, but insofar that the local authorities work broadly with the areas, they can then set CIL on a relatively fine grain basis. So the high level testing sets the sub-markets. I can talk more about how they were done in a later point. In my kind of long experience of doing all this work, normally between 5 and 10 sub-markets for a local authority would appear to be a reasonable marker. And there are 9 assumed in CIL 10, which is set out on page 11 of CIL 10. That's the high-level testing. Then we have site-specific testing, which I'd probably recognise as being a less satisfactory way of setting policy in CIL, because although much could be gained from understanding site-specific circumstances, you never quite know everything about those site-specific circumstances until the sites appear in a full planning application, and even then you have to recognise through negotiation that the situation might change over time. But in the case of this particular study, the local authority has done extensive work on trying to quantify the known infrastructure requirements in the form of physical, social and environmental mitigation. Then the third part of it, we looked mainly in the local plan implications of small sites, because the question behind the local plan was, should the local authority drive the thresholds down to a lower level in line with lots of other local authorities? So you would be asking, for example, for affordable housing on very small sites. My conclusion is that you should be asking for affordable housing on very small sites, because what matters in terms of viability is not the scale of the development, but actually the location of the development. And we can pick that up by doing a national study which would support that conclusion. But in terms of revisiting the small site question, the conclusion of the CIL report, which, for example, in table 6.5 of CIL 10, shows that if the local authority wanted to, because it doesn't have affordable housing on the small sites, it could set CIL as high as £8,000 per square metre in the highest areas, around £600 per square metre in the lowest value areas. Clearly, the council set the CIL significantly below that, but they would be justified in raising it for small and medium-sized residential schemes, should the government, in its wisdom, decide to raise the affordable housing threshold, as it suggests in the white paper, to 50 units. That's the residential. On the commercial, it's fair to say this is a more difficult, if you like, kind of analytical challenge, as the data is less voluminous than the case for housing. The analysis in my report is set out in chapter 6, and here all the commercial and other uses, including the student housing and the other uses, are set out adopting an illustrative viability assessment, residual approach, as for residential, working from a GDV, gross development value, to development costs, to a residual value, set then against the old land value benchmark. In terms of the main results of the CIL 10, for the high-level testing, table 3.3 sets out the residual values for high-level testing. The large sites, the results are set out on page 72 of that same report. It's important to state that in all cases, whether it's residential or whether it's a commercial, the report doesn't recommend a specific CIL rate for the different uses, but it does identify the surplus which is available as a starting point for the local authorities to look at CIL, and I think they, I guess, are not only looking at my report but also looking at the reality of delivery on the ground, and the and in some instances over the fence at what other local authorities are doing. That's experience from a wide field. In terms of trying to get our head around how we should look at this CIL, and we'll no doubt come back to this, but I do want to put this up front. There are 5 buffers that we've set in looking at the viability. 5 built-in buffers, and they are as follows. One is the land buffer. We've put in a land buffer at £2 million per hectare, which in essence represents a hope value for planning to change from sites which are mainly agricultural, which we talked about a few minutes ago, to a commercial use. There is second, a construction cost buffer. Many of these sites are very large. We've not reduced costs from the standard BCIS cost to take account of scale, and that will be the situation for many of the sites. And again, I'll come back to that later when we talk about the specific elements within the viability appraisal. Clearly, there is the issue for the many small sites where affordable housing is not applicable. So there's an affordable housing threshold for the small sites coming forward within the affordable housing buffer, for the small sites coming forward through the local plan. There's a fourth buffer, which is also linked to affordable housing, but it's clearly this issue that the CIL won't be charged across the full scheme. It'll only be charged actually on 65%. So 35% in the plan, viability, all other things equal, will be exempt from the CIL. So that has that's a large buffer within the way the CIL will be taken forward and how the CIL has been set. And then there's obviously the, if you like, the kind of explicit buffer, CIL buffer, which the local authority have set out in the technical papers that hopefully people will have seen. Hopefully that kind of sets the scene for the discussion and kind of tells what's in my report there.
It does. That's very helpful. Thank you for that that overview. Well, let's just dive in then and look at the various assumptions, because if you read any of the examination reports I've done, I usually put a paragraph in there around I'll describe the approach and the methodology, but I usually put a sort of health warning in there that the output from any modelling is clearly a direct product of the input, and obviously some of the inputs can have a huge impact on the what comes out the other end of the modelling. So let's start with an easy one, land values, and talk me through the council's approach on the electing to use £2 million a hectare, and then I'm going to invite some contrary views on that, because I believe there are a few. So just talk me through that land value assumption.
Okay. I think looking at it in the context of the NPPF, what we should be talking about is, again, the difference between the existing use value and the position of the landowner as it changes once the consent has been given. What kind of worries me about the term land value is the land value is set by transactions in the market, and the NPPF explicitly bans, if you like, sold prices and purchase prices. So accepting that some of those purchase prices are subject to Section 106 and are policy compliant, ultimately there are many situations which aren't. So if I could focus, our position is focusing very clearly on that change in position from a site which 70% of the supply will be greenfield to a situation where there is a very significant uplift to residential permission, even though there is Section 106 in its various different forms, including affordable housing. So I think that's why I'd like to try and focus where we're coming from. The land value benchmark of itself is, if you like, a kind of a little bit of an artificial construct, and we're always trying to get to that position, certainly in site-specific negotiations, by inputs from different sides. And it needs, where you set that land value benchmark, needs to reflect above all the local circumstances and the local situation of land supply. So reverting back to what we were talking about probably about 20 minutes ago about land supply, this should reflect the local circumstances. I understand that as from this discussion earlier, that a significant proportion of recent completions and current commitments are being agreed at policy. In addition, the major site, which we've also been talking about, I understand that the applicants are committed to the policy at 35%, along with all the rest of the infrastructure requirements. So what's gone and what's coming through now, people are saying in essence, what's the existing use value, it's going to increase to residual with the affordable and with the rest of it, and they're going ahead. The question now remains on the 75% affordable housing, 75% of housing supply, which is going to go on greenfield sites. Is the uplift from that greenfield to the residential with consent, is that actually sufficient? So if we're looking at, for example, the residual values in table 6.3 of my CIL report.
Sorry, which table?
It's table. Let me just check it. Table 6.3 of CIL 10 is on page 71.
Yeah, got it.
Assuming agricultural land value at 20,000 a hectare, the increase in a place like Virginia Water would be somewhere about 343-fold. That's a fold increase. A mid-market location, Ottershaw, 213-fold increase from agricultural, and from Staines, 125-fold increase. So this is the focus of our viability discussion and our decisions, basically on how to set the CIL. The £2 million per hectare was done in discussion with the local authority, and it was decided as a if you like I think as a fair hope value for some other use, which could in this case be commercial. If it's commercial, it's obviously going to have a lower value benchmark than if it's actually for residential. I think if you, and no doubt you would know, if you discussed this question with developers, and I must have done this over innumerable times over the last 25 years, what is a reasonable land value benchmark for us to be putting into our calculations? Answers will there come? None, because nobody wants to put their head above the parapet. So this is a really difficult concept for us to put into the appraisal. So I think we're saying the uplift is very significant. Most of these sites are going to be greenfield. The uplift from that is huge to residential, even including an affordable housing contribution. But actually, let's recognise that there is some kind of competition for that land, and if you like, a £2 million for an alternative use such as commercial is a reasonable point to start. But that's the hard facts of the matter are these uplifts in Surrey are huge.
Okay, well, I'm just going to pause you there because you've been clear in terms of what you've said, and I do agree with you. It's a very difficult area, and I've wrestled with it in many CIL examinations. But I'd like to invite others to just give a view on land values and the assumptions made. So, would anybody like to speak? Not seen any hands. Mr. Smith.
Sorry, sir. I just got lost in the system then slightly. Yes, thank you. If we have some significant concerns really over the level at £2 million, and the reference there to it being related to commercial development when we're talking about residential development, and the lack of reference to any market evidence, and as Mr. Gollan just mentioned, many sites are coming forward on a fully compliant, policy compliant basis, and really in line with planning practice guidance, which states that market transactions can be used as a cross check, rather than being completely banned by the NPPF has been mentioned. There is reference very specifically to the use of market transactions being appropriate, albeit maybe not directly setting benchmark values, but suitable for review. And the lack of any of that form of evidence within the council's papers is of significant concern, especially when the local plan viability evidence, which is also referenced, did use much higher benchmark values. I acknowledge that planning practice guidance and the MPPF has changed since the local plan evidence was produced, but the benchmark values are now very significantly lower, and there is no real evidence or definitive. I mean, it is difficult to come up with definitive lines on land values. I agree with that, but the market evidence really should come into play, and really we've asked for that to be included and set out for our review.
Okay, well, what just turning the question around on you, Mr. Smith. What do you think the benchmark land value should be?
Well, I've not been through the process of assessing transactional evidence. It is a process that does take time and some effort, but you would hope that the council could provide their advisor with details of sites which have come forward on a fully policy compliant basis in line with the requirements of PPG, for those to then be fully assessed. So at the moment, I don't have alternative numbers to throw back.
Just it's probably a slightly unfair question though, but just perhaps presenting to you what the council have said. You know, that scenario of an owner of agricultural land that suddenly gets released from the green belt or whatever, and if you look at that existing use value of agricultural when it was locked up in the green belt, and then all of a sudden it's ripe for development. The point Mr. Gollan is making is you're talking about an astronomical uplift in land value, whether it's 1 million, 2 million, 3 million or whatever, aren't you? Any thoughts on that?
Yes, I agree. It is a very significant uplift, and you know, the reference to 200 times, 400 times, in my mind, really doesn't come into a matter of working out what is reasonable. It's a market-led position, and it's a landowner-led position where they can see what other land is transacting for, and that will set their own benchmark expectations. They won't be looking at their existing use value, other than they know that it is very low, but many of these sites will have been held for many, many years, and have been used for relatively low value uses for many years. And if policy changes and they can be released, then they will regard it as being appropriate to generate as much capital as they can. Sorry, very, very market-facing view. I'm well aware, but the market transactions are referenced in PPG, and really that evidence should be provided, and that's what we've asked for. Okay.
If you stay on, don't need to mute. I'm going to just invite Mr. Jackson to come in. Mr. Jackson, do you want to join us? There you are.
Well, my point is a related point to Steve's. It's more in connection specifically with my client's site, Send in Ottershaw. That site, I mean, we are in the theoretical world, I know, of setting a benchmark land value. However, in reality, my client's site has outlined permission for residential development, and that, again, because of guidance, etc., would suggest that an alternative use value could be applied. If that approach were to be adopted, then we would be looking at a site value significantly I would say in excess of the £2 million that AGA have tested. So I mean, really for me, it's the flagging up a point of the potential disconnect between this theoretical benchmark land value and the reality as to what does happen in the real world and on the ground.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Collins, do you want to come back on what you've heard there from Mr. Smith and Mr. Jackson?
Yes, certainly. This kind of term market facing is, I think, a difficult one, because the market is working in connection with the state, and the reason why these values go so high once you've given the permission, in essence, because the development rights are in essence nationalised. So you can say you're market facing, but without local authorities having plans, that market looks very different, because anybody can basically build anywhere. I think Mr. Smith's point about market evidence, in a perfect situation, in a perfect world, you can raise that information, but the issue is that, and you very rarely come forward with systematic evidence or information which can help you to apply that evidence to the problem you're trying to solve, which is what actually is the land value benchmark, because that information is always imperfect. That information is always from a site in a different location. It's from a site where a developer's got a different mix to what the council is planning. It can be a site with different levels of Section 106. That information you can never, I would challenge it. I don't think you can ever use that information systematically to arrive at a land value benchmark. So that transactional approach, I understand it, and I've seen it on site-specific negotiations, but here I don't think you can use it in any way which is useful. In relation to Mr. Jackson's point, we're not denying that the value of the land for housing, once it's got consent, will not be in excess of 2 million, because that's actually what my figures themselves are showing. The problem is, where do you go then? What happens when you get from your 2 million up to your, I don't know, 3.6 million, 4 million, 5 million, and you say that's the permission, that's the level with the permission for housing with Section 106. And we got to that position because the consent was given, and because it's coming, from example, from an agricultural land. So it seems to me that obviously the permission with the housing will raise it above the 2 million, but I don't see what his point is there, really. Thanks.
Okay, does Mr. Smith or Mr. Jackson want to add anything further?
Yes, just the point that the market transactions will provide a context. I'm not saying that they will provide a definitive basis for direct comparison, but this is a high-level assessment, and the land value transactions will provide a high-level contextual basis for setting expectations. Thank you.
Okay, if I go back to Mr. Collins, just a question around, well, two questions. Firstly, did you look at any transactional evidence?
We asked for transactional evidence at the point at which we did the consultation, certainly for the local plan. But again, that was as good as it got, and there was no information coming forward. And obviously, in our discussions with the developers at Longcross, we had significant discussions around the question of benchmark, but without talking out of context. Generally, the conclusion was there is that we needed to find a reasonable benchmark between paid for the land, and what the residual value was for the site. So we understand what's going on in terms of that particular site in considerable detail.
Okay, and so I think the answer to the question is not in any great depth then.
Well, I think as I said earlier, so I'm sceptical about the use of that information, because I think you've never got anything that's really robust enough to use. I've used it significantly in the past, and of course there is the point that there was a consultation to this process for setting the CIL, and that was an opportunity for people to bring this information forward. And again, I'm not surprised that nothing has been raised by the applicants. And the applicants are out there in the. I understand some of the owners being on the local authority, but the applicants are out there in the market. They're the consultants to the process for the CIL and the local plan. It's really up to them to provide that information. Nothing has been brought forward. As far as we've missed something.
Okay, I'll give them another opportunity in a moment to come back if they wish. My second question. So my first question was, what transactional data have you looked at, if any? And the second question was, I completely get and understand the argument on the farm field and the massive multiplier and the uplift in value when it's released from the greenbelt, allocated for housing, so on and so forth. But I was hearing at the outset from the council that although the majority of sites are of that nature, then not all of them are. So what about the relevance of that 2 million to, say, a brownfield commercial site coming forward? I don't know the area well enough, but perhaps an old employment site within the built-up area that might come forward for housing.
Yes, I mean, obviously the 2 million that we've set should be based on the value of land, which would be, if you like, redeveloped for commercial. But I accept that in some instances you would be looking at you could be looking at a factory which is still up and running, or some kind of commercial use which is still up and running. In which case the land value benchmark would be could be above that. The question is, where do you go? I think you go through site-specific negotiations. There is a buffer built in obviously in the CIL. That's the explicit buffer I was talking about earlier, built in to allow for that. But I accept that CIL is perhaps not as flexible a way of dealing with infrastructure as, for example, through the traditional kind of Section 106, but Section 106. But there is a buffer built in there for those brownfield sites. So we're saying 2 million per hectare for those eventualities.
Well, I suppose my question is that 2 million figure for a brownfield commercial site. Yeah. Are you saying that 2 million would encompass the plus in the EUV plus, or are you relying on the buffers to generate the plus?
No. I would say, and again from experience of doing lots of negotiations and plans, if it's a brownfield site, the plus is normally 20 to 30%, or so between 10 and 30% normally for a brownfield site. It's different to a greenfield site, which are normally looked at in terms of multiples. So the methodology would be different, and I think it's fair to say the plus would be smaller for a brownfield site than it would be for a greenfield site, because normally you're getting to a high level of benchmark with the commercial than obviously with the agricultural land, which is right down 20,000 a hectare. So the plus would be smaller in those instances.
But okay, well.
And sorry, I know that we'll talk about this later in regards to student housing. I would also say for a situation where you're knocking down houses as well, knocking down existing houses, normally in my experience, that again is between 10 and 20% as a plus. So that would be the figure that you were normally looking at, because otherwise that house would be bought by in the existing market without the benefit of planning permission and hope value, that site would be bought in the market by some other owner occupier, and most owner occupiers would normally, you would imagine, be prepared to take 10 or 20% if there was no other alternative to the site.
Okay, so you're saying then that in those scenarios that 2 million would include that smaller plus uplift?
I would say if it's a 2 million, I would say that would include it, because it would assume that it was a redeveloped site. But as I was saying earlier, there may be instances where a factory's worth 2 million, and to get the factory owner out to redevelop it, you may have to pay a premium above that to him or her, in which case you'd probably be looking at 2.2 million or 2.4 million, something like that.
Understood. Okay. Mr. Jackson, Mr. Smith, want to come back on anything?
I think it's just the transactional evidence from clients that was referenced. I'm not sure off the top of my head how many transactions my clients have completed in the local authority area, but really I see that the council should be in a position to provide details of the sites that have received planning permission on a policy compliant basis, be able to give that information to the advisor, and for research then to be carried out into land registry values and to identify the site areas. So it's really a case of more work for the council's consultants.
Okay, and anything from Mr. Jackson?
So from me, it's really echoing the point that Mr. Smith made. It seems to me that there does appear to be a deficiency in that the £2 million land value really should be sort of tested or assessed against the tone of actual transactional evidence, just to help establish whether or not that 2 million value is appropriate to be used for these purposes.
Thank you. I can see a hand up from Mr. Devonshire from the council. Is he there? Okay, that's understood. Okay. Anybody? I'm conscious of the time. I think we've got a natural break coming up now, but hang on, Mr. Tanconi would like to say something. Mr. Tanconi?
Yes, sir. I just wanted to offer something for your consideration. It seems to me that planning at the moment is a rather uncomfortable mix of prescriptive rules and policies which are open to interpretation. And I wonder just how much that really fits the situations that we find ourselves in. Clearly, as a matter of common sense, landowners can expect to get very substantial incremental gains in values where policy changes and land is released. But it does stand, I think, as obvious that if you release something from Greenbelt, the immediate infrastructure requirement is going to be a lot greater than if you release something from something that is not Greenbelt, to take an extreme example. Now, given that we have funding gaps admitted by the by the council of substantial amounts of money. One is forced to wonder from the perspective of logic and indeed the well-being of the country as a whole, whether or not the inability to close funding gaps is an argument, especially given the fact that the government is unlikely to be a provider of funding gap sustenance in its straitened circumstances currently and for the very foreseeable future. Is it not logical to say the more infrastructure requirement you create by a release from an extreme example of green belt, the more contribution you would expect to the obvious infrastructure requirement that brings with it? And given a funding gap, doesn't that argue for higher and higher contributions? That has the equity for the community and the well-being of society of increasing the infrastructure provision, and it also has the effect of reducing windfall gains from landowners who are profiting from those gains simply by changes in government policy or interpretation, and not from any fundamental change in anything they control. So I just offer that for consideration.
Thank you. Thank you. I've got a hand up from Rachel Rayno.
Hello, can you help? I can't. Hello, so it's Georgina Pacey. I just wanted to let you know that you mentioned earlier on about Longcross and that you might have some more questions about Longcross today. Just to let you know, while this discussion's been going on, I've spoken to the Senior Project Officer, Nick Lloyd-Davies for Longcross, who deals with this project exclusively. So if you would like him to come on at any time, if you've got detailed questions about the Garden Village, if you want someone with their finger very much on the pulse who's dealing with this day in and day out, he would be happy to come on. So it's just to let you know that. And use the details.
Well, I'm unlikely to have much in the way of detailed questions because Council is proposing that it's zero rated, but clearly others have got views on whether that's the right approach. I should have perhaps said at the outset that the examiner's role is fairly limited in the sense that it can't put rates up and it can't impose them where there are none. But I have on occasions in the past where the evidence has pointed in a certain direction made some commentary. So I don't really want to go into the Garden Village proposal in any great depth, other than to just generally understand it in terms of an allocation and in terms of how the CIL evidence relates to it. But yeah, if he's on standby, then that would be useful. Okay. Right. Mr. Garland, I've got you still with a hand up. Do you want to make any sort of final remarks?
Yes, thank you, sir. I accept again, in an ideal world, transactional evidence is helpful. But I'm not sure what you do when you've got transactions coming in at, say, I don't know, £5 million a hectare from an agricultural site, and the developers are now saying, well, that's not viable. Everybody's transacting at £5 million a hectare. The land's changed value from 20,000 up to 5 million, and they're saying it's unviable. This would seem to me to be a quite incredible situation. It seems to me that's what's being argued here. That's all I wanted to make that final point. Thanks.
Okay, right. It's my clock says 11 minutes past 11. I think we've been staring at the screen now for hour and 40. Let's take a break till 11:30, and then when we get back, we'll run through the rest of the assumptions and see how much progress we can make before the lunch break. Okay, so if you want to just mute and close your cameras, and we'll click back on at 11:30. Okay.
Hello, you are on. Can hear you.
Hello, Charlotte.
Hello.
Is everybody back? I'll take the silence as a yes. Okay, well, let's carry on with our session. We're now going to look at sales values, and as we go through the various modelling assumptions, the process I want to go through is really what we did with land values. Land values was obviously an interesting discussion, but I'm going to start by asking the council's consultant, Mr. Gollan, to run through how he arrived at his assumptions. Then I'll invite others to make any contributions, and then I might have a few questions myself, and we'll see how we go. Some of them will be straightforward, and we'll be able to knock them off quite quickly, but others, particularly where there's a bit of challenge, we will discuss. So the next assumption we're going to look at is sales values for housing development. And again, this is one of those big variables that if you get this wrong, then it has quite an impact on what comes out at the other end. Now, just to save a little bit of time, Mr. Gollan, what I picked up from the documents is that you have, let me just make sure I get the right page. Yeah, there was a data set from January 2015 to June 2017, which was all transactions. You used that data set, cross-checked it with recent new build sales values, and then applied some indexing to September 2019. Is that right?
Absolutely, sir. Yeah, that's correct.
Okay, and if I go to the back of your final report, I'll find table A1.2 that is titled Indicative New Build House Prices.
That's right.
So that is the product of that process that you went through. You looked at basically second-hand sales. You did a bit of sense checking with what new build was available, and then you've come up with these figures. Can I just ask at that point, the data set that you used, how big was that?
The data set that I used for this was every second-hand transaction in the market for all types of dwellings between 2015 and 2017.
Yeah. Do you know how many were in there?
I'm not sure, but it was every recorded transaction by Land Registry.
Is it hundreds, thousands?
Oh, I should think that. I can check certainly for lunchtime if you want to know. But
that would be useful, just so I've got an idea of how big the data set was.
Yeah.
Okay, so looking at that table, what that's telling me, and if I just pick one column, let's go for semi-detached 3-bed. That is telling me that in the lowest value area at the bottom, which is titled Staines, Border and North, a 3-bed semi-detached house would cost me around about £420,000. And if I go to somewhere in the middle of the market, I don't know, Woodham, 490,000, and then if I go to Wentworth, way out of my price league, 1.326 million. So that's what your data is telling me. I'll just invite others. We've got some representing the development community. If there's any challenge to the figures that you've used for sales values. I'm not seeing anything, so well, we can probably move on unless there's anything you want to add, Mr. Golland.
Sorry. No, I don't think so. I mean, we index forward at a point in time in which the market, if you like, was relatively predictable during that period between 2017 and 2019. There's nothing terribly dramatic happening, so we thought that was a fair thing to do. We wanted to maintain the consistency between the database and the evidence base that we use for the local plan, bringing it forward to the CIL. So we had the same market areas, and we had the same logical methodology.
Yeah, I have in other examinations I've come across a viewpoint that second-hand sales aren't necessarily representative of new build sales values. Any thoughts on that? Yeah,
I mean, there's an allowance within the methodology is one that because I was some while back at the Centre for Residential Development at Nottingham Trent University. We developed this methodology for devising indicative new build house prices, and it's quite complex, but it involves taking the raw data, making adjustments for new build premium, and obviously adjusting for the mix, because the raw data has got lots of different types, and some of the if you like, the differentials between the different types of houses aren't consistent between areas. That's to do with what's actually there now. So, to use a really simple example, if you had if you compared the difference between terraced houses and terraced houses and detached houses in Runnymede, that differential would be completely different to what it is in an area which has, for example, in the north, which has huge numbers of terraces, because there are huge numbers of terraces, that relationship would be depressed. So we make that adjustment around the mix, make that adjustment around the new build, and there's some considerable smoothing of the data to ensure that we get consistent intervals between the data set that we've got. And I've used this methodology in hundreds of these types of situations, and it's also useful for starting points in a negotiation on an individual site. I think we run the original figures in the local plan past the developers and made adjustments for what they were feeding back to us at the time.
Okay, Mr. Smith wants to come in.
Yes, thank you, sir. Just a quick one, really. The levels of the values, I think we've not got any particular comment on those, but it's just the lack of transparency in respect of the indexation that was carried out. And Mr. Golland has stated that there is a process there that he went through, but some explanation of that would be useful, and provision of the new build evidence that has been assessed, again for context, as I've mentioned before, would be useful. That's all from me. Thank you. Okay, Mr.
Golland.
Well, yeah, again, happy to do that, but again, there was an opportunity, obviously, with the consultation for these questions to have been raised, and they weren't.
But could you say a little bit more about the index? What indexation did you use?
Sure. The indexation uses the land registry house price index and so you could look at a particular point in time. And I knew that my data set came from 2015 to 2017, so I took a midpoint of that somewhere in I forget where exactly, but somewhere in 2016 would be the midpoint for the data set. And I then looked at the house prices. Say that was 300,000, for example, more like 400,000 for the borough. This is obviously borough based. Indexed it forward to the point at time at which I did the report, which I think was April 2019. So I indexed it forward actually on that on that basis for that particular point in time.
Okay, and the other point Mr. Smith made around what exactly did you do with new build price data? What did you gather together, and how did you use that?
I did a quick cross check to to new build schemes, it's quite difficult, because you will notice that this is actually this data that you've got in A12 is indicative, and it assumes, if you like, average selling prices. With new build, if you're taking new build examples, you really probably have got to break it back on a square meter basis. But if you want me to provide further information on that, I can do.
Okay. Mr. Smith, do you want to come back on anything there?
No, thank you. That's, well, additional information really would be useful, but I think it's just a matter of the transparency on the initial issue of these documents, so we've got the full information for consultation purposes. The other matter is, of course, the impact of COVID-19, and that has been reflected to some extent, I think, in the following assessments that have been provided that we may move on to. But yeah, great deal of uncertainty at the moment, so the relevance of buffers and the like is extremely important.
We'll get to that later.
Yep.
Very, very good point. But I think you're representing major landowners and developers. I suppose sense check question for me. You're a lot more familiar with the local area than I am, but the new build prices in the table A1.2 that I'm looking at here, you're not taking any great issue with them, are you?
No, sir. No.
Okay, that's helpful. Okay, well let's talk about construction costs, and again, same order. Mr. Garland, if you could explain what you did, and then I'll invite others to make contributions.
Okay, so the approach is basically set out in A1 on page 79 of my report, the CIL 10.
Yeah.
This allows for, if you like, an average, what you can call a baseline cost. It's adjusted for the borough itself, because obviously development is more expensive here than it is nationally. The BCIS database is a national database which captures a very wide sample of different types of transactions, of different types of dwellings. I'm sure you've come across it on several occasions.
Yes.
So you know where I'm coming from. It's obviously, I wouldn't say it's uniformly accepted, but it's the best we've got, because the development industry doesn't have a systematic database which can be which can better it, or which can be set against it. So we always end up back basically at BCIS. The BCIS database is drawn from mainly to small to medium size and RSL schemes, and generally speaking, in my experience and from my understanding, volume house builders are not feeding into this database, which is why I think why in essence there is a built-in buffer in this data set. So I've seen individual house builder costs, and they can be as low as £800 a square metre, £900 a square metre. Obviously, we're working to a much higher figure here, which obviously is then knocking the residual value down at the end of the equation. You can in using the BCIS database, you can adjust for scale. So there's a table in there which allows you to effectively take account of economies of scale. So, for example, a development of around 100 dwellings would reduce, according to the data, would reduce the cost down by about 5%. So from the figures that I've used for a development of any substantial scale, you would be looking at, I reckon, costs between 5 and 10% less than those I've assumed. So that's why when I talked at the beginning, I said that there is this inbuilt cost factor. There's only really one way around getting away from the problem of using BCIs, and that is actually for local authorities to have the information, as with land values, for the developers to provide their actual selling prices, actual build cost to the developer, and that information is then kept in some kind of internal database, which can then be used helpfully in these types of fora. But that never, in my experience, really happens. So we always default back to BCIS for better or for worse.
Okay, so just so I'm clear, the values you used then were BCIS. Are they the median values?
I've used the mean, actually, the average.
The mean.
Yeah, I mean, generally speaking, in my experience, so the median usually comes up a bit lighter than the mean, but because the mean it can be affected by one-off transactions. But if you're taking from a large sample, using the mean is not a particularly inaccurate way of doing it. I've used the mean because I've used the mean always, and in all the toolkits that I've developed, and in all the local authority forums I've developed, I've worked for. I've always used the mean. It's the basis of what we put into the London toolkit.
Okay. If I just check, I mean, I understand the base that you've used, and then on top of that, just let me read my notes out and tell me if I'm right. So, in addition to that BCI base, you've added a 15% allowance for external works.
Right.
And then you've added a further allowance of 10,000 per plot to cover what's called sustainability and accessibility requirements, which is things like SANG and SAM costs, electric charging points, renewable energy. So that's correct, yeah?
Correct.
Okay. And the point you made earlier about the BCIS rates, you've not used the volume prices. You've just gone with the sort of standard figures. And the point you were making that on a volume site, they're likely to be much lower.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay. Does anybody want to say anything about those costs? So we've got the BCIS and the external works, sustainability and accessibility requirements. Anybody got anything to say on those? Mr. Smith and Mr. Smith and then Mr. Devonshire.
Thank you, sir. The setting of the build cost in line with BCIS is accepted and in line with planning practice guidance. And I appreciate that there can be some form of buffer included within that, which is understood and agreed. The main issue and the build costs that we've raised is the lack of inclusion of garages. The State of Modifications response stated that because the provision of garages isn't included in the local plan, the costs haven't been included within viability assessment, but that just doesn't reflect the operation of the market and purchasers' requirements, and those costs have surely got to be included. Just seems an omission that just doesn't reflect market expectations or purchaser expectations.
Let Mr. go and come back on that if he wishes.
Yeah, I understood actually that the query was on originally from Tilly was actually on whether they were included within whether the sample of the sales included garages, but I guess it works onto the costs as well. I suppose the question is whether really, which is one which I wouldn't expect anyone to be able to answer because I can't find any evidence for it. The question is, when you have an external garage, what actually is the impact of that on the viability of the development? It may be that for a smaller dwelling where you have a garage where people wouldn't expect to have a garage, maybe that puts a lot more onto the value of the dwelling. But where you have a larger dwelling, larger executive house, if you like, people maybe would expect to have that garage. So you have to put the garage in, and it has to be there, and you have to cost that into the equation, and then maybe you don't get so much back on the on the selling price. But the viability is actually about both sides of the equation, and I think actually I can't find any evidence that suggests, you know, when you put a garage in, what that is actually doing to the overall viability equation, whether you're getting that back on the value side. That's the first point. The second point is that within BCIS, as I understand it, is measuring the gross internal areas of a building, otherwise known as a house, and it's measuring to the inside of the external wall. So insofar there are integral garages, within developments, those costs will be picked up, and clearly where you're building a garage, it's going to cost you less than building a kitchen, so that will bring the overall costs down. I understand. I understand where Mr. Smith is coming from. There is obviously a large allowance in there for driveways, external wall, external work, and so on and so forth. Which arguably could be used to cover the costs of garages, but I think the overall issue is actually the one I raised earlier, which is actually how does it work within the equation when you're looking at both the cost side and the value side of the equation, and of course this is something which is probably best picked up at site specific negotiation level, rather than actually at a policy or CIL setting level, because A, it's not in the plan, and B, predicting the proportion of garages that is going to be on any individual site, external garages are going to be on an individual site, is almost impossible at this level.
Okay.
So it's an appeal for not to make schemes more viable, but for kind of a practical solution to the problem that we're actually faced, given the lack of information there is around this.
Mr. Smith? No, I think you're on mute.
Sorry about that. The proposed balance between sales values and costs really, just doesn't really exist in the market. As I've said, you know, the houses 3-bed plus once you get certainly the detached 3-bed plus units will have garages, single or double, and a good number of the semi-detached will have garages, and it's a matter of the houses won't sell unless they've got garages. That's a fairly bold statement, but purchaser expectations are that houses of a certain size will come with a garage. So that cost needs to be accommodated, because as we did reference in our representations, I think the first point was that garage costs should be included, and then we went on to talk about the comparable evidence that has been provided and whether all of the evidence that had been provided didn't have any garages, which of course we assumed that wouldn't be the case, because you know the vast majority of the appropriate evidence will be provided with garages. So it is very much a case of that cost needs to be accommodated. You know, I've done an assessment on say 100 market units that have all I think in line with the council's modelling, 65% were 3-bedder and above. And if we assumed 1.25 garages for each of those units, the standard cost that I'm adopting in site-specific assessments is around £7,500 per detached garage. If we assume all detached garages, you've just under £500,000 as a cost that isn't included in the modelling at the moment. So it is a significant cost that just can't be ignored.
Okay, you answered the question I was going to ask, which was what cost would you put on a garage? So you're saying £7,500 per plot.
Yeah, that's in line with our discussions with a number of national house builders. It's difficult when you get to the integral garages because it's a bit more difficult to break that down.
Yeah.
But if we just assume standalone detached garages, then that's the figure that I would be adopting.
Okay. I've got Mr. Garland. Do you want to come back on that? Or?
Yeah, I'm wondering whether Mr. Smith is arguing for a situation where somebody's building a garage but actually not getting the money back on the product. I think in most instances they're providing it, but clearly that has a return in terms of the value that goes on to the selling price. The other thing on the physicality of it, the money gap. So a good proportion of these schemes will have integral garages. There will also be linked garages as well, with several, which will be included, I believe, within the GIA of the BCIS. I think we're probably looking at quite a small amount if it becomes an issue. Probably large. I'm thinking about large detached garages set away from the main dwelling, maybe where you've got 4 or 5 beds and possibly with a room upstairs, and so it becomes effectively almost like a second area of accommodation and utility. So I don't accept the argument that this is significant or that it's going to affect the viability very much overall.
I think a review of recent planning permissions in the local authority area would give a clear indication on how many garages are provided and of what type. Again, it generates more work, but it's really crucial that that those costs are adopted because the houses won't sell without garages.
Okay. I've got Mr. Devonshire with a hand up. Mr. Devonshire? Okay. Okay, that's Okay, thank you for that. And we've got Mr. Jackson indicating.
Yes, so just a point. I was looking at your agenda and I couldn't see where else it might be raised, but with regard to construction costs and primarily materials and labour, clearly Brexit will have an influence upon that. I don't have an answer as to what that impact will be, but I just wanted to get the view of Mr. Golland as to how that has been taken account of, and the sort of the level of buffer that there might be on those costs increasing.
You want me to come back to?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. We currently I think over back since the beginning of the year to October, September, October, construction costs are virtually static. Incidentally, prices in Runnymede have been rising, I think, over the year by about 3%. So we're actually seeing over this particular year a position of improving viability despite everything, and I think that's probably just to do with shortage of housing. We did on the specific point about Brexit. We have modelled in the further paper that I did, the representations paper that I submitted, I think in July. We have run a number of different scenarios to test for not Armageddon, but to test for a whole number of things which would happen around the Brexit and around COVID and so on and so forth, where we reduce the prices, put the prices down by 5%, 10%, and combine that with analysis which suggests costs are going up. And I think it's pretty unlikely that we find a situation where costs were going up and prices were going down, because housing supply is responding predominantly over the years to an improved market. It's the only way it can keep up with high land prices. So, that terrible situation that might happen, I think, is unlikely, where we see both costs going up and prices and prices falling down. But yeah, there are obviously shortages. There is obviously potential shortages of labour, in particular with Brexit coming into force. And I guess that the people who are left building houses and construction will probably want to put their prices up in order to reflect shortage of supply. But difficult to model.
Yes, I think it's something we'll come back to a bit later when we start looking at the results and start talking about buffers and the sensitivity tests, and what Brexit means, what COVID might mean, and a bit of crystal ball gazing later, because it really does come back to that sort of in the round discussion, because clearly if a charging authority is proposing quite a narrow, limited buffer, then it's a much more significant issue than where the buffer is more extensive. And we're going to be looking at the buffers, or headroom, or whatever you want to call it, a little later when we go on to the results. So, if I may, we'll move on to housing mix and density. Mr. Jackson, you've still got a hand up. I don't know, is that okay? We come back to that subject later.
Apologies, I'll lower my hand.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Well, let's move on, see if we can knock a few more of these off. Same thing, Mr. Golland, with housing mix and density. Just tell me what you did. And convince me that your assumptions are solid and sound.
Yeah. The mix is based on the discussions that I had with the council itself, and the mix is set out in table A13, my report. So that would be page 78 is where it's set out. And it's set out on the basis of a 30 dwelling per hectare mix and a 40 dwelling per hectare mix, assuming these are the policy compliant requirements from the council should that perfect situation ever arise. The perfect situation would be good, but what we know in practice is that's a needs-driven assessment, not a demand-driven assessment. And as we were discussing a few minutes ago, in practice, the applications that come in will be much more demand-driven, based on how the developers think that they can maximise the value of the site by changing that mix. So they're not going to put in something, an application which immediately fulfills the needs requirements of the local authority. They're going to put in something which is more profitable to them. So we've tested for these mixes. It's needs driven, and if you like, it's a kind of worst case scenario in terms of viability. So this is another buffer which is in our report, because I'm anticipating that the reality on the ground when the applications start to come in for these new sites will be that the mix is if you like a configuration, or it'll be a compromise between what the local authority wants and what the developer ultimately wants to provide, and that will in practice on the site by site basis, that will show a much more viable situation than what we've assumed here.
Okay, well, just a question from me on density. So I saw the 30 and the 40 columns, and I was just wondering, well, which one's the most prevalent and where? Which is going to be the most likely one to, you know, are we actually going to see on the ground?
I believe so. It's the 30, but maybe Mr. Devonshire could expand a bit on that.
Okay. Does anybody else want to come in on that? No. I've got one question I just want to pick up. Something perhaps I should have said at the outset, that as well as those taking part, I've obviously got to go through all the representations that have been submitted by those not taking part. And one of the reps I picked up, and I'm addressing this to Mr. Golland, is the rep from Quad, which was it's rep 015 on the documents list, and they make a case that you know, whilst I think they recognise you've done the high level testing and you've looked at key sites and you've looked at small sites, their particular site doesn't fit. This is more around the type of site that you've tested rather than the mix. But they're saying, I think it's a site at North East Ottershaw, and they're talking about it being 650 to 850, and they're sort of making the case that it falls in the gap really between those that you have tested. Could you give me some thoughts on that?
Do you mean? Sorry, sir. Do you mean in terms of dwellings?
Yes.
Well, I think we've tested all the sites which are most significant to the plan going forward. That's what I understood. But I don't think there would be anything special falling within that range of numbers. Obviously, that's a big number of dwellings to be.
I think Mr. Devonshire might help us out. He's indicated. That's really helpful. That's clear. Thank you. Okay, well, can't see any more hands up, so we go on to the next item is affordable housing. I mean, I think I can be fairly brief on that, because what I'm picking up from the modelling is you've just assumed a policy compliant development in all cases in terms of the amount, proportion of affordable housing and the tenure split. And in the back of your report, I was picking up the affordable housing costs that you've used. I mean, I've just asked the question to see if anybody wants to make any comments on that. And I've got no indications, so unless you've got anything to add to that, Mr. Golland, we'll move on to the next.
Only so that we took the estimates of the costs are run in with the market housing. It's assumed at the same level. The affordable revenue is taken originally from the workshop that we held in relation to the local plan. Clearly, in practice, what would happen is that the figures could be more, where a housing association is prepared to pay more than the assumptions that were made here. So I've got 80,000, for example, for shared ownership. For social rented unit, 65% of open market value for the shared ownership, and 80% of open market value for the discount market unit. So it's kind of a best guess. That'll be defined on a site-by-site basis.
Understood. Okay. Next, on my agenda is the sustainability-related cost, but that's the 10k per plot that we discussed earlier. I did notice as well in your opinions that you actually rounded that up, because it was a lesser figure, wasn't it? I forget exactly what it was. Yeah, it's on page 81 of your report. The actual subtotal comes to 7,839, but you've just rounded it up to 10k. Now, the next one, section 106 and other infrastructure costs. Right. I think it'd be useful if you talked me through this, because something I hadn't picked up in my prep was, and perhaps well, why would I, was the point Mr. Devonshire made around where you're testing the local plan sites. There is a degree of double counting with SANG and SAM costs. So perhaps just run me through the assumptions made for, well, it's the three different types of tests, isn't it? We've got the high level, the key sites, and then the small sites. So what have you assumed there?
well, clearly the key sites have a bespoke figure in for the other figures that I've actually had taken direct from the council, and they're laid out in chapter 4 in the relevant tables that appear after each and every site. So, and there's a summary figure at the end. So, for example, for the on page 60 in Badleston West, for example, there's an infrastructure loading of infrastructure cost on page 16 of 4130 per dwelling, and those figures are going into the mix, into the viability test, alongside the additional £10,000 that we've got for the building quality and accessibility measures. So that's really the main area where we've inputted that those particular costs. Clearly on the smaller sites, we haven't included them, and they will be obviously picked up. Some of those will be picked up by the CIL that's being set by the council itself.
Yeah. Okay. I was going to ask you on the key sites.
Yeah.
I fully understood. You know, they're bespoke and tailored to the individual one, but I just want to ask you how mature and robust they are. I mean, are they, or do they vary across the portfolio of sites? Can you help me on that at all?
I think Mr. Devonshire is probably the best person to answer that question, if possible. If I can pass him that. Hopefully not give him a hospital pass.
Yes. Yep. Yeah. So it's that 1,500. It's just a notional amount, just to in case there is. Yeah. Okay, got that. Okay, just ask the question. Any contributions on that subject? Mr. Smith.
Thank you, sir. The one item of infrastructure that isn't really referenced at all within the viability assessment is the A320 improvements that are proposed and have received HIF funding, but the recently published infrastructure delivery and prioritisation (SPD) includes a requirement for 100% of the HIF funding to be paid back by developers as schemes come forward, and that is a direct cost on development that isn't included in the viability work. And it's been mentioned that that should come forward on a site-specific assessment basis, but we regard that as contrary to the requirements of MPPF and PPG, where all policy costs or all costs of development should be taken into account at this stage, rather than leaving it to site-specific discussions.
Okay, I need the council to come back on that and explain that situation. So that's the A320. Yep. Yes. Right, but there is no sort of formula that would define what any particular site would pay then. Mr. Dench has disappeared. Are you back? Okay, Mr. Smith, do you want to come back on there?
Yes, so just the principle of all policy costs being reflected in a viability assessment is set out in PPG, and it just feels incorrect, really, to be pushing things further down the line into site specifics, whereas those costs are known. There is a rate per square metre that can be adopted, and perhaps it's an opportunity to model those schemes that are reliant on the A320 with those costs within them, within the appraisals for those schemes, in order to adjust the CIL rate accordingly, rather than pushing it further down the line.
Okay. Got hands up from. We've got three. We'll go to well, Mr. Golland. I've got your hand up indication. Was there something you wanted to come back on?
Yeah, I was just going to say in response to what Mr. Smith has just said. I think, and what Mr. Devonshire was saying, I think it's really difficult, and I think the appropriate place to deal with this actually is through site specifics, because the loading, infrastructure loading, needs to be quantified, and we also need to know how much of the HIF funding, as I understand it, will be allocated to any individual site. And at the moment, it's very much a moving feast. So I don't see how you can kind of front load the analysis to take account of that. And also, by the time we get to delivering those sites, the market will have changed. The prices will have changed, the costs will have changed, everything else will have changed by that time. So I think the practicality of modelling these uncertainties into it is really, really difficult.
Which particular sites are affected?
John, do you want to comment on that?
So quite a lot. Okay. I've got Mr. Tenconi indicator. Mr. Tenconi?
Yes, sir. I just wanted to pick up what's been said by Mr. Devonshire in terms of a process, a journey, and his highlight of the fact that there is a moving feast going on, and what's been said about by Mr. Golland about the process of methodology. It is a fact that the inspector made Longcross subject to an explicit condition about deliverability of the A320 improvements. And what has been said can't be done because there is apparently no CIL contribution from Longcross. So how is any difference going to be made up, and why isn't a Section 106 determination already made for Longcross? This takes me back to the policy point I made earlier to you about the interaction between prescription and principles-based regulation. Well, I mean, there is a corollary to that, and that is the argument that if infrastructure cannot be funded because there is a funding gap that cannot be closed by a long margin, perhaps that development shouldn't be going ahead. And I'm not asking you to revisit the local plan. I'm simply pointing out that in a moving feast, the whole system can end up with completely unanticipated results.
Okay, thank you. Who's next? I've got Mr. Smith. Did you want to come back?
Sorry, sir. No, I think that was a historic hand up.
Yeah, that's okay. Historic hand, right. And Mr. Golland, is your hand historic or?
Yes, historic and unmuted. Okay.
Right. Okay. And what about Mr. Devonshire's hand? Is that current or historic? Understood. Right. Okay. Okay. Well, I'm clear. I'm clear on everything you've said. So let's carry on down the list, and hopefully the next few will be relatively quick. I've got, well, we'll probably take the next couple together: professional fees, finance stamp duty, acquisition costs, etc. Do you want to just round those up, Mr. Golland?
Yeah, sure. The professional fees we've taken as at 12%. That's the figure that's in our model, a figure which is generally accepted as being acceptable. We've also had that to include issues like acquisition costs as well. The reality is that actually volume house builders who will be delivering a lot of these major sites will have professional fees significantly lower than that. I'm sure that people around the table will hopefully recognise that, because they've got their own in-house architects, they've got their own standard design types, which is where a lot of these professional fees goes. Obviously, there's costs on surveys and surveys of various different types, but you've got a very generous allowance there, I think, for the types of sites that are coming forward. I understand that if you had a different urban site, professional fees would probably be rising up to 15%. But for these sites, 12% I think is by any standard a fairly generous assumption to be making. On the finance, we've used the same approach as we used for the local plan, and I've used elsewhere. Finance is difficult because in some senses you need to decide whether you're going to cash flow an appraisal or whether you're not, the actual cost, the actual outturn cost of the finances is dependent on the phasing. I understand, having looked at some of the reps, I understand where they're coming from in terms of cash flow, and this links into what we were saying about how certain you can be about the viability of a future project without cash flowing. Our approach, my approach here is to say, let's try and keep things relatively simple. Let's stick with a static appraisal, which looks at costs now, values now, and works its way back to a residual value, rather than trying to project in a whole load of additional variables, like by how much will prices change over the period of a long development, by how much will costs change over the period of a long development, what is the reality in terms of housing association offers. All those things can really only be picked up again at site level. And of course, the other key issue is if you look at the question of land over a long period of time. If you looked at it over the period of time of development since the Second World War, for example, during the period of development, you would find that prices were rising faster than costs, which would mean that although you could put in a land, substantial outlay for land finance at the beginning, the reality is actually those land finance costs would have been obliterated by the value of the site as it was being developed through. So those initial land financing costs are effectively obliterated by the rising gap between prices and costs. Now, I know going forward that may necessarily be the case, but there is, if you like, a kind of academic issue around how you actually treat finance costs within an appraisal. Our model produces pretty much the same outcomes as other models because we had it audited. That was the Argus, as it was, Circle model, and also the HCA model. But there is, I accept that there's a big debate about how you actually model schemes, particularly over the longer period. For long costs, we have gone into considerable detail about the phasing and the timing and assumptions around prices and the costs changing and so on and so forth. And the people who are looking at the viability for the applicants accept that it needs to be sensitive to cash flow. But cash flowing at this stage is just really, really difficult. And I think you reach a level of spurious accuracy if you're not careful and doesn't take you any further.
Okay, I got Mr. Smith indicating. Mr. Smith.
Yes, thank you. I think Mr. Golland has picked up on the points that we certainly raised in our reps in respect of cash flowing, but seems to be taking it to the point that we're looking for predictions as to where values will go, costs will go, etc. But that's not the point. All we were asking for really was what form of sales rate has been adopted, what build period. I mean, I'm still uncertain but how the appraisal works in respect of how the finance is assessed if there is no form of cash flow, because surely there must be some period of development and sales period that's assumed, but neither of those are spelt out within any of the documents that we've been provided with. So that's a fundamental really of the assessment. How long will it take to build? How long will it take to sell? Which they would normally follow in a very similar line, of course. How have infrastructure costs been factored in over the build period? How have all the other costs been factored in? And normally that is set out fairly briefly in a few lines in respect of its 3 sales per month, or however that may be appropriate for that particular location, and an estimated build period prior to first sale, which quite often is 6 months, maybe 9 months. So that's the information that we're missing, and we've asked for a couple of times. That seems to be being misinterpreted, really.
Okay, well, let's put that back to Mr. Golland.
Okay. Again, if it's difficult to actually project the timing of the development and the timing of the infrastructure, it's actually difficult to model. So I'm arguing for a relatively straightforward approach. So I'm saying basically within the model, it's saying what development development is taking place, it doesn't actually matter too much when it takes place, as long as you apportion the finance at the point at which the development actually does take place. So it's saying, you know, if you do a year's worth of development, you're then taking a year's worth, in essence, of finance on that development. Now, within the model, we can make it much more explicit. We can actually cash flow. I understand that. But what I'm saying to you with respect to this this approach is actually you do need something which is much more simplified in terms of the way that that finance is impacting as you go through the development.
So I've still not got any idea on how quickly these units that are proposed to be built are going to sell, and really how that works its way through into how's your actual finance cost assessed?
The finance cost is taken as a proportion of the construction cost itself. So whenever that construction takes place, it's picking up a percentage on that construction cost. So if you only do 2% of your development, then the finance will only occur on 2% of that construction cost.
Right. So it's a different approach.
I think it is. I think it's, and I accept that. That actually this model we have is not as sophisticated, for example, because we had the model audited, and they said actually your finance is working is not as sophisticated as, for example, Argus, and we said actually, well, let's look at the results from Argus, let's look at the results from ours, and at the end of the day it was producing very, very similar results. So we know that we're there or thereabouts, and I know from doing lots of appraisals that the figures that this approach, general though it is, does produce a fairly does produce a robust comparison with what Argus would produce. And I think there's an argument site specific. I think there's an argument to say, if you're using different models, I think there's an argument to say, let's take finance out of the equation. What's your finance cost? What's our finance cost? Have a comparison, and then kind of put it back to the model. I think that's one way of resolving this particularly difficult issue. But if there's so many unknowns about the scheme, particularly where we're really at a policy level, a CIL level, I think you probably need to keep it as simple as you can do. Because going back to this issue about on these very large long sites, where you've got a moving market, you put in front interest costs, which, because they're being funded over the initial period of the development, would effectively sink the viability of the scheme. But then what you're missing is that the scheme would be developed over a very, very long period of time, and actually over that long period of time, historically, certainly the gap between the costs and the values would widen, and therefore effectively eat back into those initial costs of funding that development. So I think the only answer is very long, is a lot of very complicated cash flow appraisals, and I see those sometimes. But then you say, well, how do we get from this answer that we've got in terms of lots of complicated cash flow schemes and results back to a simple figure like CIL?
I think that pretty much all the other CIL and local plan viability assessments that I see are worked on a cash flow basis, so it is a bit difficult just to get my head around quite how yours operates, really. And one thing I'm not clear on, because in the documentation it says that the finance allowance of 6% is applied to construction and fees, but there's no mention of finance on land there. Is there any finance applied to the land?
The land figure I found from experience, the land figure will normally be wrapped up actually within this approach that we've got. But come back to the point I was saying earlier about the larger schemes, of which many of these will be. I think you don't actually know what that land financing is without doing sophisticated cash flow. So there is a chicken and egg about this, and I would like to bet that if we cash flowed many of these with reasonable assumptions about changes in prices and costs, you would actually be putting you would actually be well covering your land financing, and arguably more so than that, because the gap between the costs and the values as things changed over time would be a greater number than any land financing based on a purchase site for the site.
Yeah, but we need to look at it as at today's date. We're not forecasting into the future.
Well, no,
and the land value, certainly on some of the schemes, are very, very significant. And if in effect there's no finance applied to those land costs, there's a significant cost missing from the appraisals.
No, that's great. I believe there's something in MPPG about cash flowing for larger sites and for phase sites. And I think if you're doing that, I think it's completely unfair to discount the fact that prices and costs over the period of time will change. Otherwise, you massively overstate the viability of the scheme.
Okay.
That's a fundamentally unfair position to be taking, because these schemes are long, and the viability will change hugely. And actually, who knows at the end of the day whether the land finance is going to be covered or whether it isn't. I understand where you come from. There should be a box somewhere for that, but I'm just kind of, the reality of it is that that part of it is relatively insignificant, and if it applies at all over the longer period, I question whether it does in some of these schemes.
Standard practice is to apply costs and values as at today's date and run them through a cash flow, not building in future value or cost increases or decreases. You know,
I agree with you, but I agree, and I agree we've got a difference on the finance cost, but I would argue that it's not significant, and actually if we tested the figures against each other on the finance, we would actually be quite close. That
may be the case, but it's just complete lack of transparency, and that's why I've had to drill down into it now, because it's impossible really to see from the documents that are published quite how things are worked out or calculated.
Okay, just to round that up, Mr. Golland, it would be really helpful if you could just simply, state in a few sentences, what have you actually done with regard to taking account of finance costs?
I've taken the total construction cost, and a proportion of that total construction cost. So obviously for large schemes, the figure is very large because the construction costs are very large. Yeah. I've taken a simple, if you like, blended approach as a proportion on a finance. I think it's 6.75 or 7%.
Sorry, let me get that figure.
That's a market figure effectively for borrowing.
Sorry, what figure?
I think I've taken 7%. I think. Hang on a second.
No, you adopted 6%.
I beg your pardon. I adopted 6%. Sorry. Which obviously that will change. That will change with the market conditions. But yeah, I've taken 6% on the whole. Hang on a minute. I think I've taken 6.75%. I think I've taken on the total construction cost. So in other words, if the total construction cost is £100, then the cost of financing it will be £6.75. That's what I've done. So it's taking a proportion each time of the finance costs the construction costs.
Where do I find that figure in the submissions?
If you look in the appendix, for an example.
So looking where?
Page 86.
86.
You'll see that other development.
I got it. Yeah.
6.75. So that's taking a proportion on the total construction cost. So whenever that development happens, it just simply takes a proportion of that cost. So if you don't develop anything in the first year, then there's no finance cost. But if you develop all of it in the second year, then that's when your finance costs will kick in.
Okay.
Sorry, my 6% came from page 51, where it's stated that I think think that was a residential assessment. Just
so which page is that?
Oh no, sorry, I was looking at the commercial developments. Apologies.
Okay. Right. Well, I've noted your respective views on that. Let's move on. Abnormals and exception, because this is usually quite an interesting discussion in CIL examinations I've undertaken. Have you made any allowance, Mr. Garland?
No. What we've done alternatively, sir, is basically to point out the as I did earlier in the discussion when I started today, is to point out the
different buffers.
Different buffers. The reason why we haven't used abnormals, I know that the MPPF says you should use it, but there's two problems. One is an academic problem, a theoretical problem, is that their abnormals are by definition, if you like, not actually normal, and I don't think you should be setting policy or CIL around abnormal situations. The second problem is, can you get that information in any systematic way? The answer is usually you can't, unless the development industry is prepared to bring some forward kind of some systematic evidence showing that there are particular types of abnormals. And clearly here, as we were discussing, 75% of the new supply is coming from greenfield anyway, so it would seem to be a bit of overkill. We were to start building in lots of abnormals to take account of development coming forward. We would be, I think, again, understating the viability of the individual schemes.
Okay. Mr. Tenkoni wants to say something.
Excuse me, sir. Yes, I don't know where the 6.75% financing cost came from. It sounds to me very high for a firm like Aviva Investors, who I understand would probably be the borrower, or at least the owner of the borrower. Don't know, of course, what term has been envisaged, but as I say, in the current marketplace, 6.75 sounds very high.
Okay, thank you for that. We can probably be quite quick on issues of profit and contractor return, because these have been well trailed in other places, including other CIL examinations. You've taken a developer's return of 20% and contractor return of 6%, which tend to be the sort of go-to values. So I'll give an opportunity for others to challenge those, but I think you get 2 ticks in the boxes there. Mr. Tenkoni, are you still indicating? No.
Sorry, I think that's historic, sir. I'll take
Okay, no problem at all. It's fine. Okay, well, I think that gets us to an interesting discussion through the kind of the moving parts that go into the model, the different assumptions, and it can be fairly heavy going through those. But I think it's important to do them one by one, so we can sort of pick them out and just test the different views. And that was some of that stuff was really helpful for me in understanding. I think this comes to this point. Sorry, who's? Hello. Oh, I hope you can all still hear me. It's at this point where we clearly start looking at the results of the modelling. It is closing in on 1 o'clock, and I'll just take some soundings on whether we probably take a break at this point. Well, if I go to the council. If we could perhaps ask Mr. Devonshire, we could get Mr. Devonshire on screen. Yeah. Yeah, I was just really taking stock that having now been through all the assumptions, the next bit is I guess the important bit where we start to look at the results, and we'll be looking at obviously the high-level testing, the key local plan sites and the small sites, rather than start that and spend 10 minutes on it and then break off. I think if we break now, but just so we don't lose too much time, would you be comfortable coming back at 1:45 to 1:45? Okay, I'm going to just ask anybody got any problems with a 1:45 restart? If so, please indicate now.
No.
That's really helpful. So, okay, well, if you could mute and turn your cameras off, we'll be back at 1:45. Okay, thank you.